than 260 days and counting since Hillary Clinton held a proper press conference, and at the same time breaking from long history of campaign decorum. She's now not allowing reporters to be inside her campaign fundraisers. So there's some transparency things going on there. Alex, welcome.
Thank you, John.
And first of all, I want to say I've been on vacation for 2 weeks, so please be gentle with me today.
Aren't I always?
I'm barely capable of speaking in anything resembling coherent English. But the question I have for you is, the Clinton campaign today, for sure, is on defense on a whole bunch of different fronts. So of the various areas where they're on defense, where are they most politically vulnerable?
Okay, let's just break it down one by one. One, I think not having a press conference matters exactly not at all to anybody other than the media. And I'm all for transparency, and as a member of the media, I say Hillary Clinton should have more press conferences as a campaign strategy for the Trump campaign, as a piece of strategy for the Trump campaign to use. I don't think it makes a difference. As you and I have both worked on magazines, we know that there are a lot of editors who do absolutely nothing but are listed on mastheads anyway. That is what the Clinton campaign is saying about Huma Abedin being an assistant editor of this Muslim journal. Her mother, however, is the editor-in-chief. This magazine said things that were directly in opposition to Hillary Clinton and a lot of the values that a lot of Democratic voters share, a lot of American voters share. And I think that could be a potential problem for the Clinton campaign. But I think the biggest hole they need to fill quickly is around the Clinton Foundation. This has been something that has been teed up for years. The fact that the Clinton campaign is still taking those foreign donations at this point seems highly questionable as a piece of strategy.
Right. All right. So I'm going to try to do them one by one also. Hillary Clinton should have press conferences.
Yes, she should.
It's important.
Do American voters care?
But it is important to democratic accountability. Hillary Clinton should have press conferences. 260 days without a press conference is bad.
Yeah.
In the same way that Donald Trump should release his tax returns. I will say again for the 100th time on this show. You know, I believe I'm called the managing editor of Bloomberg Politics.
And that actually means nothing.
And I manage nothing and edit no one. So there's that. And I don't think that many voters who are in the middle of the electorate care about Huma Abedin one way or the other. I'm sorry to say. I know people on the right will hate me for saying that, but I think it's true. The Clinton Foundation is a huge problem. And it's a problem because in our last Bloomberg Politics poll, you got 53% of people in the country who think that the fact that the foundation accepts foreign donations is problematic. That's a number that starts to get into the only area I care about anymore, which is actually persuadable voters, people out there who are not already committed to Donald Trump or already committed to Hillary Clinton, and importantly to a set of voters who are, I think, another interesting subset, which is the subset that is not deciding between Clinton and Trump, but is deciding whether they're going to pull the lever for Hillary Clinton as they normally would for a Democrat, or pull the lever for Donald Trump as they normally would for a Republican. I think there are a lot of Democrats who are unsettled by the Clinton Foundation, and they have not cleaned this up. The way they've handled it today and the fact they're scrambling around suggests that they recognize a vulnerability in that area.
We didn't even get to talk about the 15,000 emails.
No, we did not. But maybe let's do that tomorrow. We'll talk about the emails.
Something tells me we'll be talking about it more this week.
The emails never go away.
Campaign fundraising tallies for July came out this weekend, and at first glance, it was an impressive haul for Donald J. Trump, billionaire. Last month, setting a new personal record, the Republican nominee raised $36 million, spent only $18 million, and has about $38 million bucks still in the bank. He also loaned his campaign $2 million. But instead of investing that cash into the TV ad war and operational ground game, most of Trump's spending went toward a firm that handles digital ads as well as merch, travel, and reimbursing Trump-owned companies for campaign expenses.
All right, now compare that to Hillary Clinton, who last month raised $51 million for her campaign, spent $36 million, and has $58 million in cash on hand. And as Trump rolls out his first general election ad, Hillary Clinton's campaign has reportedly reserved $80 million worth of television airtime in battleground states this fall, which will include spots like the one that the campaign released today that once again uses Donald Trump's own words against himself.
In times of crisis, America depends on steady leadership.
Knock the crap out of them, would you? Seriously.
Clear thinking.
I know more about ISIS than the generals do, believe me.
And calm judgment.
And you can tell them to go themselves.
Because all it takes is one wrong move.
I would bomb the shit out of them.
Just one.
Like that sound of that jet taking off there, or
I like the long beeps.
Or maybe a missile being launched. I don't know what. All right, so Alex, here's the question. As a matter just of campaign mechanics, right? You have these two campaigns. The Trump campaign now looks more like an actual campaign than it has before, just in terms of its finances. There's some exceptions to that. But as we head into the traditional start of the general election, Labor Day, where do these campaigns stand relative to each other?
Look, I mean, this is the question we've been asking. How much do the sort of the traditional levers of a campaign matter? How much do they pull? How much weight do they pull in this cycle? I think Donald Trump needs to run ads. I think spending your money on venues and planes and hats does not win you the American presidency. However, there's a really interesting article in the Times today by Nick Convasori that also talks about the outside spending groups. And that is where you see a dramatic difference between these two campaigns. Nick Convasori, one of the reporters who wrote the piece, says basically that Trump is running a pre-Citizens United campaign.
Right.
Hillary Clinton is running a post-Citizens United campaign. That matters. If you look at the spending totals to date, Priorities USA, which is the Clinton super PAC, $131 million. Make the Great America PAC, which is effectively Donald Trump, $12.1 million to date. That is a major difference in spending.
I'll tell you about the other piece of that, which is that the Priorities USA still has nearly $40 million cash on hand today, still like holding it.
With 40 million odd pledged in addition to that.
So, look, I think there's no question that the Clinton campaign is in a better state as an operation. I don't think anybody in the world would disagree with that. They are better. They have ground operations. They have targeting operations. They're using data in a sophisticated, modern way. They're on the air. All that stuff is true. It continues to be surprising to me that although it is unquestionably true that Clinton has established a real lead nationally and in a lot of battleground states, that Trump is still in a lot of places within striking distance, and that he now is raising money to put him in a position to close that gap. But to close that gap will require big changes on the part of the candidate and actually doing more with that money to make him look that is like normal campaign operational stuff.
Although the hats will be collector's items.
The hats are special. All right, when we come back, I don't own one though.
One day, you just put out the plea publicly. Can you send him a hat?
And the man, give the brother a hat. When we come back, we'll have Donald Trump's TBD immigration plan right after this quick break. Over the weekend, Donald Trump met with Hispanic leaders who later told news outlets that the Republican nominee was reversing course on his Republican nomination fight campaign position, that the estimated 11 or so million undocumented immigrants in America would and should be sent home if he becomes president. Team Trump has since been pushing back on those reports as they start a week which they intend to be squarely focused on immigration, or at least they intended that to be the case. We'll talk about that more in a minute. If only they had a new campaign manager who could go on the Sunday shows and clarify exactly where Donald Trump stands on this signature issue of his.
What Donald Trump said yesterday in that meeting differed very little from what he has said publicly, Donna, including in his convention speech last month in Cleveland. It's that we need a, quote, fair and, quote, humane way of dealing with what is estimated to be about 11 million illegal immigrants in this country.
Will that plan include a deportation force, the kind that you just heard in that soundbite and that he talked about during the Republican primaries?
To be determined.
Okay.
Okay, indeed. All right, this morning in a phone interview with Fox News, Trump took his turn at addressing the confusion, but didn't make things that much clearer. And the Clinton campaign is working hard to remind voters about Trump's previous statements, as offensive as they were to many Latinos. Trump's expected policy speech on immigration in Colorado, which they were talking about for a while, happening on Thursday, has now reportedly been postponed for reasons as yet unknown. Alex, assuming that Trump actually wants to shift on immigration, and that is a big assumption, if he wants to shift, if he wants to pivot, to use the term of art, how much room does he have to actually do that given the nature of his campaign, what he said in the past, where Hispanic voters are now?
Not a lot of room, John. I mean, I think this is different than NAFTA or arming Japan with nuclear weapons. This is an issue he has been very public on. He has used language like, we're going to round people up. I believe September 27th of last year said, we're rounding them up in a humane way. Did you like Eisenhower? He did this in the 1950s with, of course, Operation Wetback. That's the kind of stuff that Hispanic Americans, Americans in general, remember. That is a very strong flag. A big flag he has planted in the ground. I think it's very hard to get more wiggle room around that.
You know, the campaign, there's been a discussion about this for a long time. You know, people now have forgotten that Donald Trump went into a New York Times editorial board and had an off-the-record conversation that is claimed by some that he said, oh, I'm really not serious about the wall, we're really not going to build the wall. Trump has trashed the New York Times, trashed everyone, said, I'm building that wall and we're deporting these people. He said it over and over and over again. So is there some way that Trump could give a word salad speech that allowed him to posture and use words like humane and use words like law-abiding and fair? Is there some way he could give that speech? Yeah, he could give that speech. Would it matter to very many Hispanic voters? I don't think so.
Probably not. Donald Trump has been making a broader, concerted effort to reach out to non-white voters. Today, the RNC released some fairly low-budget web videos in English and Spanish, ones that make the economic case for Trump's policies. Possibly you have noticed these not-so-subtle additions to Trump's stump speech over the past week.
We reject the bigotry of Hillary Clinton, which panders to and talks down to communities of color and sees them only as votes. That's all they care about, not as individual human beings worthy of a better future. Nearly 4 in 10 African-American children are living in poverty. I will not rest until children of every color in this country are fully included in the American dream. What do you have to lose? You're living in poverty. Your schools are no good. You have no jobs. 58% of your youth is unemployed. What the hell do you have to lose? And at the end of 4 years, I guarantee you that I will get over 95% of the African-American vote. I promise you.
Over 95% of the African-American vote. What does Trump's running mate, Mike Pence, think about that last part?
He says by 2020, he's going to have 95% of the African-American support. Why are you laughing?
A number of public polls show Trump getting support from 2% or less of African-American voters. John, 2% or less. What's up with that?
2% or less. I think I'm not a statistician, nor do I play one on TV, but I believe that's within the margin of error in almost any poll, which means there could literally be in some places zero.
Or negative.
Or negative numbers. I'm not sure how that's possible. I think this goes back to our previous topic in an important way, and I don't think this is a novel thesis of mine, but I do think that Trump, the people who are around Trump now are trying to calm down the Republican establishment and So doing these things are not really about trying to get very many African-American votes. The reality is, for most black Americans, the day that Donald Trump took up the birther cause was the day that he lost those voters. He'll never get them back. There's nothing he can do. And I'm sure he knows that. This is about projecting a calmer, a more supposedly at least making an effort at inclusion, calming the Republican establishment down, and more importantly, sending a signal to suburban Republican-leaning voters who have been freaked out by Trump seeming intolerant, maybe making them feel just a little bit more comfortable. That group that I was talking about before, will I vote for Trump or do I stay home? Maybe they'll be a little more comfortable and come over to him if they hear him sounding a little bit more like a normal candidate.
Just as a piece of strategery, the nihilism of what do you have to lose?
Right.
That's, as arguments go, I mean, you have to hand it to Trump for innovating.
Well, that's what I said to you when I asked you to come on the show.
What do you have to lose?
You said
I took the bait.
You're like, what do you have to lose?
took the bait. It's a questionable line of strategy. It's decidedly Trumpian.
All right, coming up, Republican Congressman Jason Chaffetz. We'll be right back. Welcome back. As Hillary Clinton's email saga continues, House Republicans are now accusing the Democratic nominee of perjury, claiming she was not truthful about her email practices during that 11-hour hearing with the House Benghazi Committee last year. Our next guest sent a 6-page letter to the U.S. Attorney of D.C. outlining a potential case against Clinton. Jason Chaffetz is a congressman from Utah and heads the House Judiciary and Oversight Committee. Congressman Chaffetz, thanks for being here.
Well, thank you.
And being the second most famous Utahn that I've ever heard of.
Butch Cassidy being number one. We're so proud.
One of the things I learned in our pre-interview discussion, Butch Cassidy, the most famous Utahn ever.
I think that's probably right.
I'm really proud of myself that I can say the word Utahn so well.
Not everybody can do it.
Okay, so you're up here talking email, right? Yeah. This morning, some news broke that there are now 15,000 new, previously undisclosed emails that the FBI has discovered as a result of some of your questioning. So just tell me about what you think that means.
Well, we're trying to get at the truth. I mean, it's Hillary Clinton that created this in the first place. The Inspector General got involved, found that there were classified material that was floating in a non-classified setting. That's why they gave the referral to the FBI. But I was stunned when I heard the testimony from the FBI director that as they did this year-long probe, that they never looked at the testimony from Hillary Clinton on Capitol Hill when she had raised her hand and was under oath. And you can't come and lie to Congress.
Right. So I'm trying to figure out, you guys have the FBI has now sent you a bunch of material.
Yes.
I know there's some confusion about there being different briefing books. What is the basic deal with what you think is wrong here? Do you think that the FBI is basically in the tank for Hillary Clinton? Is that the basic accusation?
I have the greatest respect for the FBI. My grandfather was a career FBI agent. I think Mr. Comey is not dealing in a political situation. I'd come to a different conclusion than Mr. Comey does. But let's remember...
On the law.
On the law. He is caught up on intent. I think there was intent. The fact that she set up this server on the very day that she started her Senate confirmation hearings, I see evidence that points to the idea that she didn't want to have to report this information and never make it public. But when you are the Secretary of State, your official dealings are of public record. Right. And it's one of the biggest breaches of national security that I have actually seen. And that's the worry is, what I want people back home to understand is there's not just one email service and, hey, I forwarded on here to Gmail and I can. No, there's a separate secure system for classified material and then a non-secure system. How is it that she's extracting data, or those around her are extracting data and transferring that onto a non-secure system?
I want to focus right now on the perjury question, because that is a very serious charge you've leveled. John Dean, famous from his Watergate time, now a Republican nominally. He's drifted a little to the left for sure, but really issued a scathing broadside against you and Chairman Goodlatte, basically saying you guys are engaged in the horribly disgusting kind of a political effort to smear Secretary Clinton. And it seems to me like on all of the 4 charges, a lot of what the dispute comes back to is the question of intent, that you must, to perjure yourself, you must know you are lying. You must be intending to deceive. Is it your argument that doesn't matter, that's not part of what perjury is about?
The statute itself says that intent to house this classified information in a non-secure setting. And that is clearly what she did. She gave between 2 and 10 people access that didn't have security clearances, the proper security clearances, access to classified information.
But none of those
things... The reason that... And it started wasn't because of House Republicans. It was because of the Inspector General.
None of those things go to the perjury question, right? The perjury question is about what she said in the Benghazi hearing versus what she told the FBI. And Dean's argument basically is that in every one of these instances, she could have clearly not... There's no intent to deceive in any of the evidence that's in the record.
But what the FBI director testified to is that he never did look. The FBI did not look at her sworn testimony under oath. And that is, politicians lie, but it's a whole different level when you come to Congress under oath and give sworn testimony. The fact, I didn't go into that hearing thinking I was going to ask for that, but the fact that the FBI never looked at it, he said he needed a referral from Congress, and I said, I'll give it to you later this day.
You're a politician, right?
Yeah, I think so.
Are you lying to me right now?
No.
Okay, I just want to be clear.
The whole truth and nothing but the truth.
You just now said politicians lie, and you're a politician, so I just want to make sure that I'm not just being lied to right now.
I said they lie. That is not against the law. I said it is a matter of law. They don't do that.
Why is Utah in play?
Well,
in the general election? One of the most Republican states in the country, Hillary Clinton is within striking distance of Donald Trump there. Why is that?
We have a large libertarian streak that I think runs through me and a lot of others in Utah. Donald Trump did not help himself way back when in the primary when he came and challenged the Mormon credentials of Mitt Romney. I don't think that was well advised and needs some cleanup. Mike Pence is coming to Utah soon, and the one thing that will unite Republicans is their dislike of Hillary Clinton. And I think when given the choice between the two, Donald Trump gets on message, reaches his hand out to Utah and Nevada and Arizona, by the way, sort of the 3 of us, he's going to have to do that.
How do you feel about the fact that the guy who's now the CEO of the Trump campaign referred to you in email as a sniveling little SH apostrophe,
yeah, I got the apostrophe T.
Yeah, asterisk T. How do you feel about that? That's the guy who's now leading Donald Trump's campaign, nominee of your party.
I hope he has more important things to worry about. I was a place kicker once upon a time in college. Kind of get used to that sort of stuff, so I don't think much about it.
Are you fully happy, confident, and excited about the nominee of your party?
Much more so than Hillary Clinton, absolutely. I mean, I find Hillary Clinton to be one that will look into the camera and lie to the American people. I disagree with several of the things Donald Trump has said and how he said them, but that is far better in the context compared to Hillary Clinton.
Jason Chaffetz.
Thank you. Home of Butch Cassidy.
Always an extraordinary pleasure. A man who is extraordinarily well known, if not quite as famous as Butch Cassidy. Up next, the ad man and the rapid responder, two political pros, join us right after this.
In Hillary Clinton's America, the system stays rigged against Americans. Syrian refugees flood in. Illegal immigrants convicted of committing crimes get to stay, collecting Social Security benefits, skipping the line. Our border open, it's more of the same, but worse. Donald Trump's America is secure. Terrorists and dangerous criminals kept out. The border secure. Our families safe. Change that makes America safe again. Donald Trump for president.
That was Donald Trump's latest and only general election ad, which was released this Friday and will air in 4 battleground states. With us now to break down this ad and so much more is Fred Davis, a Republican strategist and media consultant who joins us from fair Santa Barbara. We are also joined right here in New York City by Liz Smith, a Democratic strategist who was Martin O'Malley's deputy campaign manager and the director of rapid response for President Obama's 2012 campaign. Great to see you both. Liz,
Thank you.
How do you grade that ad?
You know what? I'm going to grade it an F because, and I know, look, that's rough. Because, look, the Trump campaign is trying, as you said earlier, with their outreach to African Americans and Hispanics to kind of soften his image. It's not really about winning over their votes. It's about telling, white suburban voters, hey, it's okay to pull the lever for me. I'm not that racist. But what it ultimately comes down to here is, and so that completely contradicts that, because it uses some of that kind of ugly imagery and ugly language that, Syrian refugees are overrunning our country. And that, ugly imagery that goes back to Jesse Helms doing race baiting in 1994 with the white hands crumpling the pink paper. Sorry, didn't mean to go all the way back there, but
all the way back.
Right, all the way back there. My dad's from North Carolina, so I had to do it. But
Liz giving away her age a little bit here.
Yeah, but look, one thing I would say is this: is the bigger problem here for Donald Trump is the temperament issue, and I think the contrast with this ad and the RNC ad is pretty stark, and it kind of shows the multiple personality disorder of his campaign right now. And Donald Trump's biggest problem is that he is addicted. He is an addict, and he's addicted to personal insults. And you know what? His campaign, his aides, his family have had multiple interventions with him. He has agreed that this is self-destructive, this is bad behavior, but he keeps repeating it. It keeps insulting people and keeps on alienating the people he needs to come over to his side.
That's a perfect transition to Fred Davis, who I've had multiple interventions with myself, and I've usually has been to encourage him to drink more bourbon. So, Fred, my question for you, we have been waiting a long time for the first real Donald Trump ad. You are a famed, esteemed, sometimes controversial ad man. You've seen this ad. Grade it on both as a piece of art and as a piece of strategy.
Well, first of all, it's hard to imagine that Liz is in the rapid response business, isn't it? And F, the only thing I thought was a little mysterious on it wasn't it the Two Americas John Edwards campaign theme? There seems to be a bit of a steal there. I thought it did what he needs to do. I think, John, you and I have talked about this a lot. I think this race comes down to old versus new. If you like the way things are going now, if you like the way things have gone the last 8 years, vote for Hillary, because it's going to be the same. But most people, a lot of people in this country don't like the way things have been. And Donald Trump might be a bit of a roll of the dice, but he's something different. He's something new. And I think it was probably a pretty good start. Unlike Liz, I believe, I thought it was pretty calm. And I think calm is something that he needs to do. Now, she's talking about the difference between the ad and his personality. I'll give her points there. But I think that is what the campaign needs to do. And that's probably some influence from Kellyanne, because I know she's been around there longer than she was just until recently. She was elevated to campaign chair or campaign manager.
But what's new about grievance politics? What's new about blaming all of our problems on immigrants? I don't see it as anything new. I don't see it as anything that will appeal to people outside of his base and outside of the people that he has already won over to his side. So I respectfully disagree there.
Fred, can I ask you about some of the language he's using in there when he talks about the system being rigged? I was just writing a piece for The Atlantic and talking to former Obama 2012 strategists who said, in 2012, after a lot of legislatures passed voter ID laws, we had to be really careful about the way we talked about that with our voters. If you tell people the system is rigged, it actually depresses turnout. And that what Trump is doing is not in service of his end goal, which is to become president. Telling people that the system's against you actually doesn't serve as a motivating factor to get people at the polls. You think that's fair?
Oh, good luck on your story. I've read quite a few like that. I think it's a Trumpism. I think it's Donald Trump doesn't like to lose, and right now in most polls he's behind, and I think that's just his way of saying, hey, I'm going to give it my best shot, and if I don't win, it's not my fault. I think that's way down in the weeds for the average voter, though. I'm reading a lot about that.
Whiny and like a sore loser, and again, I think it plays into the temperament. So.
I want to go to the Democratic side with you.
Sure.
So today, for a rare moment, Donald Trump sent out a press release today that basically said Hillary Clinton had a horrible day.
Yes.
And you read this press release and you thought, unlike many press releases from both sides, where you look at them and say this is ridiculous, you looked at the Trump press release and said, yeah, it's not been a great day for Hillary Clinton. If you look at the range of stories of the day.
Yes.
How do you think they're doing, that campaign, at handling the email onslaught, the foundation onslaught, the transparency questions, Huma, all of that? How are they doing? Just grade them as a practitioner.
Oh, I am sorry to my fellow Democrats, but I would not give them a good grade on it. Look,
are you hovering in the F territory?
You know
with
what?
that?
I would say that's a. Oh God, I'm going to say like a D there. And this is why, because. One of the biggest idioms, one of the biggest lessons in life, whether you're in politics or not, is when you're in a hole, stop digging. Her staff needs to take that shovel out of her hands. And I mean, I was just shocked over the weekend to read this report that she's throwing Colin Powell under the bus. Why are you picking a fight with Colin Powell right now? Colin Powell was a big endorser of Barack Obama's in 2008, big endorser in 2012, probably was going to be a Hillary Clinton endorser, and now is an adversary. It doesn't make any sense to me. And I think, look, you can't get in a time machine, go back and undo all her public statements and undo all of their refusal to acknowledge her initial wrongdoing here. But their continued obfuscation here, I think, is troubling, and it prolongs the story.
Fred, let me just really quickly ask you this. If you had to, there's a little bit of all the wood behind many arrowheads problem with the Trump campaign right now. There's a lot of things to shoot at on the Clinton side. If you had to focus, would you focus on the foundation? Would you stick with these email things? Would you go after other matters of transparency? Where's the place where you as a Republican see Clinton as most vulnerable among these various controversies that are playing out right now?
Oh, in Trump's words, I would just say the crooked or questionable character side. I wouldn't use Trump's words, but I would use all those as arrows, John. But I always like to have a common theme, and the common theme is something about untrustworthiness, iffy, questionable. I don't go over the top generally, and I would just keep.
It's an interesting definition of I don't know where the top would be if you have. You've been over every top I've ever heard of. Mr. Demon Sheep doesn't go over the top. Okay, there you go.
It worked. It worked. I think you could easily go over the top on Hillary, but I think a constant drip, drip, drip of all these millions of things that keep coming out. The question to me will be not John and Mark, but the mainstream, normal, typical press. Will they continue to be on Hillary's side? Because right now they're a great asset. And, if you think about the email things, everybody I run into is, let's forget the emails. Why do we keep talking about emails? Well, it's a pretty serious charge. The press has not exactly laid it out as a real serious charge. So with these little missteps, and I agree with everything Liz just said, this time, will they begin to fall off the Hillary train and maybe get a little more reasoned? I don't know.
I just want to see more ads with Demon Sheep, Fred. I need more Demon Sheep ads this election cycle, or it's a failure. Fred Davis.
I have a few coming. I have a few in my pocket.
Ooh, deep tease. Fred Davis.
Busy week last week.
Liz Smith, I hope I never get graded by you on a paper. Thank you both for your time. We will check in with both campaigns and the reporters following them in just but a moment. And if you're watching us in Washington, D.C., my hometown, you can now listen to us on the radio at Bloomberg 99.1 FM. We will be right back.
next guest tonight is two more guests tonight. Two reporters covering opposite sides of the aisle on opposite ends of the country today. From the left coast and the best coast, MSNBC political correspondent Casey Hunt from my hometown of Los Angeles, California. She's covering Hillary Clinton. And in the east, or at least sort of east, NBC correspondent Katie Tur, who is out in Akron, Ohio, covering Donald Trump. Casey, Katie, I have to use good diction to distinguish between the two of you. Katie Tur, Donald Trump was going to pivot on immigration this week. We were waiting for a big speech on Thursday. Now, not so much. No speech. What's going on?
Yeah. A campaign source says that that immigration speech has been postponed, unclear to when, unclear to why. We also know that his public event in Las Vegas on Friday has been canceled. I'm not sure we can say that Donald Trump is pivoting on immigration yet. I think it is telling that he didn't outright deny the idea that he could be thinking about amnesty for undocumented workers here in America. Neither did his campaign. But to say that Donald Trump is officially pivoting or moderating, I think that would be jumping the gun. After all, we're still unclear on where he stands with his Muslim ban, whether it is still a Muslim ban or if it is just a territory ban, if he's moderating on that. So I think at this point we got to chalk up this immigration policy to just one of the many issues that we just aren't very clear on when it comes to Donald Trump's platforms.
Casey, you're out west where all good things happen. What the Clinton campaign is focused on, they have to focus defense on a number of fronts, whether it's emails, Huma Abedin, the list goes on. Where are they focusing their triage right now?
I think the Clinton Foundation has become kind of the center of this. Obviously, the email issue is something that's been ongoing, that's been extremely distracting all the way along. It's one of those things where you never know what might pop up. And I would actually add something we haven't talked that much about in the last 24 hours, but the hacking of the DNC and particularly the DCCC, just something kind of in the background to worry about as far as, moving forward. But I think the Clinton Foundation, it's very clear that they have gone through this in a methodical way. They've been working on this for a long time. They've decided that the second to last week in August is the best time to let everybody know that this is how they're going to handle it. And then, of course, you do have the email and the Clinton Foundation issues kind of coming to a head with these new Judicial Watch emails that show communication between Doug Bann and Huma Abedin. So far, no real smoking gun. It's mostly, one or two lines back and forth. And the Clinton campaign, of course, saying that there was never any sort of quid pro quo or special treatment for donors to the Clinton Foundation. But if something like that were to surface, I think it could be particularly problematic. And I think it's very clear that the Clintons, Hillary Clinton, Bill Clinton, Chelsea Clinton, are all very involved in trying to figure out how to make sure that the foundation doesn't present a problem if Hillary Clinton's elected.
Casey, you mentioned that they've been dealing and grappling with this problem for months now, but I guess, do you feel like the campaign is under pressure right now to get the foundation to stop taking foreign donations before November? Because right now it's predicated on Hillary Clinton becoming the next president.
I actually think that if it weren't for Kellyanne Conway and this flap over the immigration speech you guys were just talking about and whether he's going to moderate, I felt like the Trump campaign was actually having a little bit of success getting some traction on an issue that they wanted to talk about. You saw this kind of Breitbart-style email go out yesterday about increasing pressure on the Clinton Foundation to shut down entirely. I think that, Robbie Mook had some trouble answering questions about this on the Sunday shows. He was pressed repeatedly, and while he was happy to turn and talk about Donald Trump and his tax returns, I struggled to find a really clear answer from him as to why it is that it would make sense for them to continue accepting foreign donations while she was Secretary of State through this period, if in fact it would be inappropriate to do it after November. They, of course, are saying, well, we don't want to get ahead of ourselves. We're just going to worry about getting her elected, and then we'll make sure we take care of the foundation on the backside of that. I think it could continue to cause problems for them. I think how much it does just depends on how many distractions Donald Trump gins up for himself.
Katie, let me ask you this question about, you're right. I didn't want to go too far in saying there was definitely going to be a Trump pivot on immigration, but the notion of Kellyanne Conway on TV this weekend saying to be determined about the deportation force, and obviously the reporting coming out of those meetings with Hispanic leaders over the weekend suggested something was afoot. Does the Trump campaign believe that there is a way in which it can improve its standing with Hispanic voters, or is this just part of an image thing that's really more about white suburban Republicans than it is about actual Hispanics?
You know, I'm not sure what they believe, but I think what they're trying to do is figure out how they can amend their deficits among moderate Republican voters, and that's hurting them more and more with the polls as of late, but also their deficits among potentially Latinos. I mean, that is a very steep hill to climb at this point. Donald Trump's support among minorities is very low at the moment. In some cases, 1, 2, 3% when it comes to those polls. So just moving away from the deportation plan, I'm not sure that would be enough to change the minds of Hispanic voters after this 14-month campaign where he has said repeatedly that he wants to deport all 11 million undocumented immigrants and that he wants to build a wall, and talking about Judge Curiel not being able to be unbiased because he's of Mexican heritage. So I'm not sure that the Donald Trump campaign has anything in their arsenal to get Hispanic or Latino voters back on their side. So the idea that it's maybe making white suburban voters more comfortable with the idea of Donald Trump does make more sense. We saw last week him trying to appeal to African American voters, at least on the surface of it, but he's doing that to the vast majority of very large white crowds where very few minorities are, and very white neighborhoods. So it could be the idea of them, the campaign, trying to convince these voters that he's not the racist that he's being made out to be by some in the Hispanic community or the minority community or on the left.
So, you know, maybe with Hispanics, Donald Trump's going to have to tear down that wall before it was even built. All right, Casey Hunt, Katie Tur, thank you. When we come back, the doctor is in, or maybe the doctors are in. We'll be making house calls after this.
Hillary's tired. I do. When I saw Hillary at the press conference sitting down with the police, with a Democrat-appointed police chiefs, pretending she's pro-police, it was one of the most pathetic press conferences I've ever seen.
What do you mean?
Well, first of all, she looks sick.
That was America's mayor, one-time mayor of an American city, and Trump surrogate Rudy Giuliani on Fox News this morning, questioning Hillary Clinton's health. This is not new in the Trump campaign. It started this month with a video portraying Hillary Clinton as a stuttering, short-circuiting robot. A week later, Trump questioned Clinton's strength and stamina. And last week, his national spokeswoman, someone who is not a medically trained doctor, Katrina Pearson, she offered her own medical diagnosis.
He has said that she doesn't have the strength or the stamina for a very long time. That part is nothing new. What's new are the other reports of the observations of Hillary Clinton's behavior and mannerisms, specifically with what you just showed in those previous clips, as well as her dysphagia, the fact that she's fallen. She has had a concussion.
Hold on.
On top of all this, the Trump campaign has been getting some direction from the hand on the end of this proctology exam, the conservative media, like the Drudge Report, which this month posted an old photo of Hillary Clinton with the headline, quote, "Hillary conquers the stairs." And also, Steve Bannon's former employer, Breitbart, attacking the media for staying, quote, "strangely silent" on this issue.
And then there was Sean, I never claimed to be a journalist, Hannity, who brought out the Fox News medical A-team, his phrase, this month for a full Clinton physical. And to make it seem legit, Hannity brought props.
Well, you know, the picture that you showed as she's going up the stairs speaks a million words. So is she really fatigued? Is she dehydrated? One of the main reasons why she fell in 2012 and had the concussion was severe dehydration. They're holding her and going up the stairs, so she may be really dehydrated. She may have arthritis. She may have back pain. She may have fallen again that we don't know. So there are a lot more questions that's unanswered.
Well, as it turns out, we can buy costumes, too. This Sunday, Rudy Giuliani backed up these wild assertions with the one source of medical knowledge no one should ever question, the Internet.
Her campaign and a number of people defending her saying there's nothing factual to the claims about her health, and that's speculation at best.
So go online and put down Hillary Clinton illness. Take a look at the videos for yourself.
So, taking our cue from that helpful tip from Mayor Giuliani, we decided to jump right in on the old internet machine here. We looked up Hillary Clinton illness, and we found multiple articles debunking these wild-eyed lunatic conspiracy theories. And while we were moseying around on the internet, we also thought, hey, let's see what's up with this Rudy guy. So we Googled Giuliani dementia and came up with Giuliani seriously may be suffering from mental dementia from the medical experts at something called the Ring of Fire, who have about as much medical expertise as we do.
Maybe yes.
Alex, as I remove my surgical scrubs, I feel like I should be like this throughout this.
You actually should, because you need to keep your hands sterile.
This
for the pending operation.
Here we are, the anatomy of a smear/conspiracy theory.
We are the anatomy of two journalists who put on costumes in a questionable decision made very, very quickly during a commercial break.
And yet I feel very good about it. I'm better about it than I think these people should for spreading this ridiculous garbage about Hillary Clinton. Just please tell.
This has been going on for a long time. I do not think there is a panoply of things that the Trump campaign has to choose from. Dementia, dysphagia, other medical terms beginning with D. I would say probably stick away from those.
If you don't have a medical degree, shut up. Like, shut up. And especially, even if you have a medical degree like urology.
Even if you have scrubs on.
Also, shut up. Okay, we'll be right back. I'm just saying. Okay. All right. You got to head over to BloombergPolitics.com right now for all the latest on Clinton's newest batch of email woes and all of her other woes. You know what's happening this week? Alex Wagner here.
Whoa.
Next few days.
Maybe. I hope I get invited
Coming up
back.
on Bloomberg TV, we got the CTO of JD.com. That's on Bloomberg West. Until tomorrow, I have to say to you sayonara while Alex says
Namaste.